The heavy, reverberating clang of a massive steel gate echoed off cold concrete walls as it slammed shut behind Dwayne Johnson, sealing him inside a grim, underground fighting pit deep within the bowels of a notorious maximum security prison. Under harsh, unforgiving lights that stung his eyes, Dwayne found himself thrust into a brutal arena where the air was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and despair. Roaring inmates and corrupt guards encircled the pit like a pack of wild predators, their eager chants of "savage" and guttural screams filling the space with an atmosphere of imminent violence. In that dismal arena, every face around him was contorted with hunger for bloodshed, every eye glinting with merciless anticipation. Standing at the very center of this hellish stage, Dwayne's mind raced as he swiftly assessed his surroundings, a chaotic blend of crude makeshift barriers, splintered metal, and the indifferent, jeering crowd that surrounded him. His gaze, steady and calculating, swept over the violent mass and finally locked onto his opponent, a hulking, aggressive fighter whose muscles rippled under sweat and whose wild eyes promised a ferocious battle. At that moment, Dwayne understood a brutal truth. Survival in this merciless pit depended solely on his ability to fight with precision, courage, and relentless determination. There was no escape here, only the necessity to prove his worth in a contest where every blow could be his last. As he adjusted his stance, mentally preparing himself for the life or death confrontation ahead, a sinister voice cut through the din. From a raised platform high above the pit, a corrupt politician, known in these dark corridors as Victor Cromwell, looked on with arrogant amusement. Draped in expensive, ill-fitting attire that starkly contrasted the grim surroundings, Victor sneered as he mocked Dwayne's predicament. "Let's see how tough the famous Dwayne Johnson really is," Victor jeered, his voice dripping with cruelty as he leaned forward, relishing the forced humiliation and the raw display of vulnerability before him. The jeers and savage chants from the assembled inmates and guards swelled into a deafening roar, a unified call for carnage that left no room for mercy or compassion. In that charged moment, Dwayne's expression turned deadly calm, a mask of determination honed by years of overcoming adversity, and he resolved silently that he would fight not only to survive, but to defy the twisted spectacle orchestrated by Cromwell and his cronies. Every nerve in his body hummed with focused energy as he braced himself for the onslaught of violence that was now inevitable. With the heavy stench of oppression hanging in the air and the merciless eyes of his captors fixed upon him, Dwayne knew that the battle ahead would not merely be for his life, it would be a war for his dignity and a defiant stand against corruption that had poisoned this wretched place. As the echo of the gate's slam faded into a tense, oppressive silence, Dwayne's surroundings came into sharper focus. The pit, a crude circular arena carved out of cold, unyielding concrete, was ringed by a motley assembly of inmates and disreputable guards, all eager to witness another bout of savage combat. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast long, distorted shadows that danced eerily across the blood-stained floor, intensifying the grim reality of the setting. In every direction, murmurs of anticipation and rough laughter intermingled with the clamor of jeering voices. Amidst this chaos, Dwayne's eyes locked onto his massive opponent, standing at the opposite end of the pit, a hulking brute with a vicious scowl and bulging muscles that pulsed with raw, untamed aggression. It was immediately clear that this was no ordinary fight. Survival here depended not just on strength, but on a razor-sharp mind and the ability to stay composed under the most extreme conditions. Dwayne's thoughts flickered back to the events that had led him to this nightmarish place, a bitter tale of betrayal, of a powerful politician's twisted vendetta against him. Weeks earlier, after Dwayne had publicly challenged corruption at a televised event, false evidence had been planted against him by a cabal of corrupt officials. Within hours, he had been convicted on trumped-up charges and transferred to this underground hell, where the powerful Victor Cromwell ruled with an iron fist. Cromwell's influence was everywhere in this forsaken prison, and he derived sick pleasure from forcing inmates into brutal fights for his personal entertainment. As Dwayne surveyed the pit, he noted how even the guards seemed to relish the violence, their eyes cold and calculating as they placed bets on the impending fight. Their raucous cheers and savage chants, void of empathy, were directed solely at the prospect of bloodshed. In that moment, Dwayne's heart pounded not with fear, but with a steely resolve. He knew that every move he made here would be scrutinized not only by the jeering crowd, but by Cromwell himself, who delighted in crushing the spirits of those who dared to defy him. With every ounce of focus, Dwayne recalled his training, years of discipline and grit that had been forged in the crucible of adversity, and silently vowed that he would not let Cromwell's vile games break him. As he steadied himself, the sounds around him began to coalesce into an almost rhythmic cadence, the low hum of distant ventilation, the metallic clink of chains, and the sporadic shouts of inmates. Each sound reinforced his determination to fight, to reclaim his honor from those who sought to humiliate him. In that oppressive moment, the weight of injustice, the cruelty of betrayal, and the overwhelming urge for vengeance converged within Dwayne's soul. He steeled himself for the brutal contest ahead, fully aware that every punch thrown and every dodge executed in this pit would serve as a defiant repudiation of the corrupt forces that had ensnared him. In the midst of the escalating tension, time appeared to slow as Dwayne's opponent, a towering, muscle-bound fighter with a wild look in his eyes, charged across the pit with reckless abandon. The sheer force of his advance sent a shockwave through the blood-soaked arena, and for a split second, the gathered crowd held its collective breath in anticipation of the impending clash. But Dwayne, with a mind as sharp as a honed blade, reacted instantly. With a swift sidestep that was almost balletic in its grace, he evaded the onrushing attack, his movements fluid and deliberate. As if guided by an inner rhythm born of years of disciplined combat training, he shifted seamlessly into a lethal fighting stance, a posture that exuded calm control and unwavering resolve even in the face of certain peril. The sudden silence that fell over the crowd was palpable, their raucous cheers dissolving into stunned whispers as they realized that Dwayne Johnson was no ordinary prisoner forced into this savage game. In that charged instant, the atmosphere transformed from one of indiscriminate violence to a contest of raw, unyielding skill, a battle that promised to test not only physical might, but also mental fortitude. Amid the hushed awe of the onlookers, Dwayne's steely gaze swept across the pit, taking in every detail of the grim environment, the jagged edges of shattered concrete, the glint of sweat on hardened foreheads, and the malignant smiles of corrupt guards who secretly delighted in the prospect of another brutal spectacle. His mind raced as he quickly calculated the weaknesses in his opponent's approach, noting the overzealous swing of a wild fist, the slight lag in his step, and the vulnerability in the way he leaned forward. Every detail was logged with clinical precision, fueling Dwayne's resolve to turn the tide in his favor. His thoughts briefly drifted to the greater purpose behind this fight. Beyond mere survival in a pit designed for bloodshed, he had vowed to expose the rot that permeated this institution. He remembered the unjust trial, the fabricated evidence that had condemned him, and the corrupt politician, Victor Cromwell, whose twisted amusement was now a living, breathing presence in the shadows above the arena. Cromwell's mocking voice still echoed in Dwayne's ears, taunting him with the promise of humiliation. But Dwayne would not be broken. As he squared his shoulders and tightened his grip, he silently vowed that tonight's battle would be the first step in dismantling the web of corruption that had ensnared him. Every calculated breath he took was a testament to his inner strength, every measured movement a silent declaration that true power lay not in the cruelty of tyrants, but in the unyielding spirit of those who fought for justice. The silent murmur of the crowd, now tinged with an undercurrent of respect, marked the beginning of a contest that would forever alter the dynamics of the pit, an epic confrontation between the forces of raw brutality and the indomitable will of a man determined to reclaim his honor. With the stage set and the crowd's feverish anticipation hanging in the air, the brutal contest began in earnest. As the wild opponent lunged again, Dwayne's body moved like a well-oiled machine, each movement precise, each counter a masterstroke, honed through years of rigorous training and countless trials. The first clash of fists rang out like the toll of a death knell, echoing off the pit's barren walls as flesh met flesh with unrelenting force. Every blow exchange was measured against the backdrop of a system designed to dehumanize and subjugate, a system that Dwayne now vowed to dismantle from within. His eyes, fierce and unyielding, were locked on his adversary as he ducked under a wild swing and retaliated with a series of rapid, calculated strikes that left the opponent staggering. In that chaotic melee, the gathered inmates and corrupt guards, once united in their bloodthirsty anticipation, were forced to confront the undeniable reality that Dwayne Johnson was not a mere pawn in their sadistic games. His defiant poise and extraordinary skill sent a ripple of silent awe through the crowd. Yet, as every punch and kick reverberated across the concrete floor, Dwayne's mind remained razor-sharp, acutely aware that this fight was but one battle in a much larger war. His thoughts shifted momentarily to the origin of his imprisonment, a twisted, orchestrated act engineered by none other than the notorious Victor Cromwell. The memory of that fateful day, when false evidence was planted and a powerful politician's cold ambition had sealed his fate, steeled his resolve. Dwayne understood that every drop of blood spilled in the pit was a direct affront to the corruption that had ensnared him, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit that would not be silenced by tyranny. As his opponent faltered under the weight of Dwayne's relentless assault, the atmosphere in the pit transformed. The once unchallenged roars of the crowd shifted to a murmur of astonishment, as even the most hardened criminals could not help but recognize the power and determination emanating from Dwayne. In that pivotal moment, as his adversary's wild swings became desperate and erratic, Dwayne capitalized on the opening with a brutal combination of strikes, a series of precise, bone-crushing blows that forced his opponent to collapse in a heap of agony. The sound of each impact, punctuated by the dull thud of breaking bones and gasps of pain, was like a verdict passed on the forces of corruption and cruelty that had brought him here. Every muscle in Dwayne's body vibrated with controlled fury, yet his face remained a mask of stoic determination, reflecting a man who had transcended the boundaries of the pit to become a symbol of defiance against injustice. As the echoes of the final blow faded, a profound silence fell over the arena, a silence laden with the weight of a promise that had just begun to be fulfilled. In that quiet, charged moment, the fate of the corrupt system and the very soul of the institution that had wronged him began to unravel, one devastating strike at a time. In the wake of the decisive blow that sent his opponent crumpling to the blood-stained floor, Dwayne Johnson stood tall amidst the chaos, his presence now radiating an aura of undeniable triumph. The once raucous pit, alive with the savage cheers of bloodthirsty inmates and the mocking laughter of corrupt guards, fell into a stunned, reverent hush as every eye fixed upon him. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, a collective breath held in anticipation of what would come next in this brutal spectacle of survival and defiance. The remnants of shattered concrete and splintered metal bore silent testimony to the violence that had just transpired, while the oppressive glare of the floodlights transformed the arena into a stage for a reckoning that went far beyond mere physical combat. Dwayne's opponent, now a broken figure lying motionless on the gritty floor, symbolized the collapse of the savage hierarchy that had long reigned within these walls, a hierarchy maintained by fear, hatred, and the corrupt machinations of Victor Cromwell. From his elevated vantage point, Cromwell's cold, arrogant gaze swept over the scene, his twisted smile faltering for the first time as he witnessed the unexpected reversal of power. The corrupt politician, who had reveled in orchestrating these clandestine spectacles to assert his dominance, now found his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble before his eyes. In that charged atmosphere, Dwayne's steady, controlled voice rang out, carrying not just the promise of retribution, but also a clarion call for justice and dignity. No man, no matter how deep his corruption or how vicious his schemes, can break the human spirit, he declared, his words echoing with the weight of hard-fought wisdom and unyielding resolve. His declaration resonated through the silent pit, a rallying cry that sent ripples of awe and cautious hope through the assembled crowd. Even the most hardened inmates, who had long been numb to the cycles of violence and degradation, could not help but recognize in Dwayne a force that transcended the physical, a force of integrity and defiance that was as inspiring as it was intimidating. As murmurs of respect and quiet admiration began to replace the earlier jeers and taunts, Dwayne took a moment to survey the faces around him. Each pair of eyes told a story of struggle, of survival in a world that had lost its way. And in that moment, he silently vowed that his fight was not merely for himself, but for every soul oppressed by the venom of corruption and cruelty. With a final steadying breath, Dwayne turned his attention back to the fallen figure at his feet, a stark reminder that even the mightiest of bullies could be overthrown when confronted with relentless courage and the unbreakable will to stand up for what is right. The pit, once an arena for sadistic entertainment, was now transformed into a battleground for truth and justice. A transformation that had been set in motion by a single defiant man who refused to be broken by the forces that sought to control him. Even as the echoes of battle slowly subsided, the oppressive reality of the underground prison fighting pit remained, a stark, unyielding reminder of the cruelty and corruption that festered within these walls. Dwayne Johnson, battered yet unbowed, moved methodically through the arena as he began to gather not only his composure, but also vital information about the dark workings of this brutal institution. Every step he took was measured, every breath a testament to the resilience that had carried him through countless trials. His mind, still razor-sharp from the adrenaline of combat, meticulously cataloged the subtle nuances of the environment. The echoing footsteps of guards patrolling the perimeter, the murmurs of scheming inmates, and the distant sinister laughter of those who took perverse pleasure in orchestrating such spectacles. Dwayne's eyes, unwavering and intense, locked onto the figures of the corrupt guards whose eyes glittered with a mix of greed and sadism as they collected bets from fellow inmates. He noted the way they moved with a calculated indifference, their loyalty to Victor Cromwell absolute and unquestioning. Meanwhile, the sinister presence of the corrupt politician loomed large, Victor Cromwell himself, a man whose wealth, influence, and callous disregard for human life had enabled him to orchestrate these underground fights with impunity. Cromwell's smug, self-satisfied expression was briefly visible from a raised balcony that overlooked the pit, a silent puppeteer reveling in the spectacle of suffering and degradation. Dwayne's thoughts churned with quiet fury as he recalled the series of events that had led him to this forsaken place, a cruel twist of fate engineered by false accusations, a sham trial, and the machinations of a man who saw him as nothing more than a pawn in his sadistic game. Yet, amid the chaos and brutality, Dwayne's resolve only hardened further. He knew that his survival in this infernal pit depended not just on physical prowess, but on the strength of his mind and spirit. Every injury sustained, every bruise and scar etched onto his body, was a reminder of the injustice he had been forced to endure, and a catalyst for the righteous vengeance that now burned within him. In the dim, flickering light of the underground arena, Dwayne silently vowed to turn the tables on his captors. He would not allow the twisted games of Victor Cromwell to continue unchecked. Instead, he would expose the rot that had infested every corner of this institution and dismantle the corrupt hierarchy that had imprisoned him, both physically and morally. With each careful observation of the guards' routines and the inmates' behaviors, he began to form a plan, a strategy to not only survive the brutal fights, but to eventually reclaim his freedom and restore his honor. The oppressive atmosphere of the pit, thick with fear and despair, was about to witness the spark of a rebellion that would begin with one man's determined struggle to overcome the darkness that had sought to crush him. As the distant sounds of clanging metal and murmured conspiracies drifted through the stale air, Dwayne's inner resolve shone like a beacon of hope, promising that even in the most hopeless of places, the human spirit could prevail against tyranny and cruelty. Night deepened its hold over the underground arena as the frenzied crowd slowly began to disperse, leaving behind a residue of whispered awe and reluctant admiration. Dwayne Johnson, though battered and marked by the savage contest, remained at the center of the pit, a living testament to resilience and defiance in the face of overwhelming corruption. His breathing was heavy but measured, each exhale a quiet assertion that he would not be broken by the vicious games of those who thrived on the misery of others. Around him, the atmosphere shifted imperceptibly as inmates and guards alike, who had moments before reveled in cruelty, now exchanged glances of stunned recognition. They saw in Dwayne not merely a fighter, but a symbol of hope, a man who had turned the tables on a system built on injustice and degradation. Even as the distant sounds of footsteps and murmurs signaled the return of the corrupt administration, Dwayne allowed himself a brief moment of introspection. He surveyed the pit, its walls stained with the residue of countless violent encounters, and silently vowed that this was only the opening chapter of a much larger battle. His thoughts wandered to the ultimate architect of this cruel theater, Victor Cromwell, whose twisted amusement at the suffering of others had long maintained a stranglehold over the prison. Dwayne knew that to truly reclaim his freedom, he must first shatter the power that Cromwell wielded over every dark corner of this facility. The faces in the crowd, once filled with mocking derision, now reflected a dawning respect and a cautious hope that perhaps, one day, the vicious cycle of brutality would be broken. In that fragile moment of collective awareness, Dwayne's resolve deepened into a steely determination. He realized that his fight was not merely a means of survival in a hellish pit, but a clarion call for justice that extended far beyond these walls. Every bruise on his body, every scar etched into his flesh, was a silent chronicle of the struggle against an oppressive system that valued power over human life. The memories of false accusations, of a sham trial that had led to his imprisonment, burned in his mind as a constant reminder of the stakes involved. In that darkness, Dwayne forged a quiet, unyielding promise to himself. He would dismantle the corrupt machinery that had ensnared him, piece by painful piece, and expose the true face of tyranny for all to see. As he stood alone in the center of the pit, the oppressive silence of the night enveloping him, Dwayne's eyes shone with the fierce light of a man who had discovered an inner strength that no force of cruelty could ever extinguish. His determination was palpable, a silent, potent force that promised that the twisted games of the corrupt would eventually crumble beneath the weight of unwavering courage and steadfast resolve. In the cold, unyielding aftermath of the brutal contest, as the night slowly surrendered to the faint glow of approaching dawn, the underground arena began to reveal the full extent of its corruption and decay. Dwayne Johnson, still standing amid the echoes of violence, took a deliberate moment to gather his scattered thoughts. The battered floor beneath his feet told a story of relentless cruelty, a narrative written in the spilled blood and shattered remnants of shattered dreams. Around him, a few loyal inmates and even some disillusioned guards lingered, their expressions a complex tapestry of fear, awe, and tentative respect. They recognized in Dwayne a spark of something far greater than mere survival, a promise of rebellion against the corrupt regime that had long fed on the misery of the weak. Every detail of the pit, the jagged scars on its concrete walls, the flickering dim lights overhead, and the oppressive atmosphere of dread, served as a constant reminder of the twisted power wielded by Victor Cromwell. Cromwell, whose smug, self-satisfied presence had dominated this grim spectacle, now appeared almost vulnerable, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble under the weight of Dwayne's unyielding spirit. As Dwayne slowly made his way to a shadowed corner of the arena, he allowed himself to reflect on the insidious network of corruption that had led to his unjust incarceration. He recalled the day when, in a moment of impassioned truth, he had dared to confront a powerful politician on live television, only to have his words twisted into damning evidence against him. That betrayal had cost him his freedom and had thrown him into this merciless pit where every day was a battle for survival. Yet, rather than succumbing to despair, Dwayne's resolve had crystallized into a single, unbreakable purpose: to expose and dismantle the rotten edifice of power that had brought him to this dark place. As the murmurs of the few remaining onlookers faded into the background, Dwayne's eyes narrowed with a fierce clarity. He mentally mapped out every guard's routine, every shift in the chaotic rhythm of the pit, and every subtle gesture that might betray an opportunity to turn the tide in his favor. In that quiet, charged moment, the seeds of a counter-offensive began to take root within him, a plan to not only survive the next fight, but to gradually erode the corrupt foundations that had sustained Victor Cromwell's twisted games for so long. Dwayne knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, and that every move he made must be executed with absolute precision and unyielding discipline. With the first tentative light of dawn creeping in through the narrow, barred windows of the subterranean complex, Dwayne rose from his contemplative state, his face set in a mask of determined calm. He vowed silently that the day would come when he would reclaim his freedom and restore dignity not only to himself, but to all those who had suffered under the oppressive rule of corruption and cruelty. The bleak corridors of the underground prison, stained with the echoes of past brutality, seemed to whisper a promise of eventual redemption, and Dwayne, with a final, resolute breath, stepped forward to meet the challenges that lay ahead. As the oppressive night slowly yielded to the fragile prelude of morning, the relentless pace of the underground fighting pit did not abate. Instead, it morphed into a simmering cauldron of tension and anticipation, where every prisoner and guard was a reluctant participant in a system built on violence and exploitation. Dwayne Johnson, still bearing the bruises and scars of his recent confrontation, now stood not only as a fighter, but as a beacon of unyielding resistance. The crowd that had once roared with savage delight began to murmur in hushed tones, their earlier jeers replaced by a growing respect for the man who had defied the corrupt order. In that moment, Dwayne's eyes scanned the pit, absorbing the faces of those who had been forced to live in a world where brutality reigned supreme. Many of the inmates, hardened by years of despair and ruthless survival, regarded him with a mixture of admiration and cautious hope. They saw in him a glimmer of possibility, a chance that perhaps the endless cycle of violence and corruption could finally be broken. At the same time, the ever-watchful eyes of the guards and the sinister smirks of those loyal to Victor Cromwell betrayed an undercurrent of anxiety. The corrupt politician, who had long orchestrated these spectacles as a means of asserting his dominance, now found his carefully maintained control threatened by Dwayne's defiance. In the dim light, Dwayne recalled the injustices that had led him here, the public defamation, the sham trial, and the merciless betrayal by those in power. Each memory fueled his determination to fight not just for his own survival, but for the liberation of all those trapped in this cesspool of cruelty. As the last vestiges of night faded into a pale, uncertain dawn, Dwayne resolved to channel his pain and anger into a plan of resistance. He began to mentally rehearse every possible scenario, every tactical move that could help him expose the deep-seated corruption that had reduced him to a mere pawn in Victor Cromwell's twisted game. His mind, sharpened by the crucible of combat and the relentless pursuit of justice, worked feverishly to piece together a strategy that would one day bring the puppeteer's empire crashing down. In that solemn, reflective hour, Dwayne made a silent vow. He would transform his suffering into a weapon, a tool to dismantle the systemic rot that had not only stolen his freedom, but had also tormented countless others. The murmurs of the onlookers, now imbued with a mixture of dread and hope, served as a powerful reminder that change was possible, even in the darkest corners of the human experience. With every beat of his determined heart, Dwayne prepared to embrace the next chapter of his brutal journey, knowing full well that the road ahead was fraught with danger and sacrifice. Yet, in that quiet moment of resolute introspection, he also understood that true strength was born not from the absence of fear, but from the courage to stand against it, and to fight relentlessly for a future defined by justice and dignity. At last, as the full light of day began to seep into the underground labyrinth, Dwayne Johnson stepped out from the confines of the fighting pit with an air of solemn triumph and steely determination. The echoes of the brutal contest still reverberated through the cavernous space, a stark reminder of the savage battles waged in the name of power and corruption. Yet, Dwayne's stance now was one of quiet authority, a silent promise that his ordeal was only the beginning of a much larger war against the forces that had wronged him. He could feel the weight of every injustice he had suffered, the false accusations, the orchestrated betrayal, and the ruthless exploitation of his very essence by a corrupt regime led by the cunning Victor Cromwell. But rather than succumb to despair, Dwayne's inner fire burned even brighter, illuminating a path of resistance that he intended to follow no matter the cost. As he surveyed the grim surroundings of the pit one final time, he saw not only the shattered remnants of a brutal spectacle, but also the seeds of a revolution waiting to sprout. His gaze drifted to the faces of the few who had remained, a motley group of inmates and disillusioned guards, each reflecting a silent acknowledgement that change was possible, that the tyranny of cruelty could be overturned by the unyielding strength of one man's conviction. With the corridors of the underground prison now bathed in the soft light of a new dawn, Dwayne stepped forward into the uncertain future, his resolve hardened by every drop of blood shed in defiance of oppression. He carried within him the lessons of that fateful night, that true courage is measured not by the size of one's muscles, but by the power of one's will, that even when trapped by a system designed to crush the human spirit, the spark of defiance can ignite a blaze of transformative change. In that transformative moment, Dwayne silently vowed to expose every layer of corruption that had ensnared him, to dismantle the twisted games of Victor Cromwell piece by piece, and to stand as a beacon of hope for all who had suffered under the weight of injustice. As he emerged into the light of day, leaving behind the oppressive darkness of the underground pit, his every step resonated with the promise of retribution and renewal, a promise that the forces of hate, however formidable, would ultimately crumble before the indomitable strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. With his head held high and his heart filled with a resolve that echoed far beyond the confines of that forsaken arena, Dwayne Johnson walked toward an uncertain future, one that he would reshape with his own hands, one brutal fight at a time.